Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this RSIS webinar on Malaysia's interests in the South China Sea. I am Ariel, Coordinator of Malaysia Program at RSIS, and I'll be opening today's webinar by explaining our goals today. It is difficult to discern Malaysia's policy goals and implementation on South China Sea. In commentaries, the ASEAN claimants are often grouped together and ranked based on their acquiescence or defiance towards China. This glosses over important facts, such as how China deals with each claimant quite differently, and each claimant's vastly different stakes and strategic culture. We often don't get the full picture on Malaysia's approach because there is rarely a writer who has knowledge of the full range of Malaysia-China relations, of which the South China Sea is but one part, and Malaysia's engagement with the US and its allies. One also needs to understand Malaysia's legal claims and its role in bringing members together in ASEAN to maintain ASEAN solidarity on this issue, despite having overlapping claims with some of its members. Finally, one has to have close contacts with key personnel in Malaysia's defense and security establishment, because much of its policy thinking is not made public. Malaysia has sought a tight control over public sentiment to avoid inflaming nationalistic fervor on this issue, although this is increasingly difficult with the intensification of its domestic politics. On China, it has generally been non-confrontational and deferential. Malaysia has historically led the region in engaging China bilaterally and in bringing China into ASEAN Plus arrangements. But this should not be mistaken as Malaysia having chosen. It is a hedger, like most ASEAN states, and a subtle one. On the one hand, it appears to downplay its security challenges while privileging economic benefits and closed-door diplomacy. On the recent West Capella incident, a ministerial comment gave the impression that Malaysia was more concerned about US-China rivalry than challenges from foreign vessels in its disputed waters. Yet, this would not be one's conclusion if one takes into account Malaysia's actions across multiple arenas. First, Malaysia has been proactive in protecting its claims through avenues afforded by international law. Second, it has low profile but significant defense and security cooperation with the US and its allies. Third, its government departments have at times been vocal about its security concerns, along with a more assertive China towards Malaysian claims since 2013. For instance, Malaysia's inaugural defense white paper, prepared through wide consultation within and outside the government, highlighted Malaysia's concerns over military tensions there. Significantly, it noted China's militarization and perceived aggressive actions in the South China Sea. At the same time, China remains a critical source of trade, tourism, and investment. So how does Malaysia prioritize these interests, and how will this evolve? We have brought together a group of experts today to enlighten us, and I will now hand over the mic to our chairperson, Dr. Johan Saravanamuttu, Adjunct Senior Fellow at RSIS and Professor Emeritus at University Sains, Malaysia. Prof, please.
Thank you, Ariel, and a very, very good morning to all of you. I can see 103 participants now. It is indeed my pleasure, my privilege to moderate this session on Malaysia's interests in the South China Sea with this distinguished panel of speakers, some of whom I know quite well. Of course, Ariel has given us some of the pointers to talk about, but our experts will speak specifically about some of the issues that they have been writing about. I won't preempt what they want to say, but let me just quickly point to some of the, I think you've got the information sheet that's distributed to you, but very quickly point to some of the key issues that they would have to address. The first one being the Malaysian establishment's perspectives on the South China Sea. What exactly is that? What are Malaysia's priorities, economic, political, security, and geopolitical? The second sort of question would be its policy goals and responses, possible cooperation with claimant states. What sort of cooperation have existed in the past and could be, carried out in the future? Shifts in position, if any, among the different administrations. since Najib, we won't go further back, or maybe even a bit further back we need to, Mahathir's second tenure, and now the current government under the Perikatan Nasional. What sort of shifts have taken place, if at all? And finally, it would be an assessment of Malaysia's achievements, if in terms of its interests, in terms of how it has been able to advance its interests in its exclusive economic zones, in its claims to the various group of islands and features in the Spratleys group of islands. So those are the kinds of questions that we will want to have our speakers or panelists answer. So without further ado, I would like to quickly introduce all the speakers first before I ask them to make their presentations. I'll begin with the most senior, my good friend, Professor B.A. Hamzah. Yeah, we were together in USM. Professor Hamzah is a lecturer in strategic studies. He's a doyen, you might say, of maritime security studies in Malaysia. He's been served in all kinds of capacities with the government. He was a visiting scholar of international law at Cambridge University and so on. So I think he will be an excellent speaker, indeed, to speak on some of the broad issues of geopolitics, great power rivalry and so on, and how Malaysia deals with these questions. The second person I would like to introduce is Dr. Meng, who is the associate professor at the University Malaysia in Sabah, UMS. His research interests include East Asian security, Malaysian politics, China-Japan relations, and he's currently the Dean of the Center for the Promotion of Knowledge and Languages in UMS. And he's taken a very keen interest in the maritime territorial sovereignty issues in Malaysia, especially in relation to Sabah's perspective. So I think we will hope to hear from Dr. Meng about that particular perspective coming from virtually the vertex of the kind of South China Sea questions being located in Sabah. And we also have two other speakers, Shahriman Lockman, who is with IDSS. He's a fellow in the Foreign Policy and Security Studies Division. He's written extensively on questions relating to security and the South China Sea. In particular, he manages the Institute's China Engagement Initiative, which promotes Track 2 dialogue with Malaysia and China. So we'd like to hear from Shahriman, on the kinds of things that we don't get to read in the newspapers or in the op-eds. What is happening in those areas. Then we have our discussant, who is Dr. Collin, an expert on naval policy. So he will pop a lot of questions, I'm sure, to our panelists, but he will also share with us his various interests and his of course, copious knowledge about the South China Sea. So without further ado, let me now ask our first speaker, Mr. Shahriman Lockman, to say a few words in about 5 to 8 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Johan. And thanks very much to the Malaysia program at RSIS for this invitation. I have to start with a disclaimer. My views are my own personal views. They do not reflect those of my institute, nor the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the government of Malaysia, so on and so forth. Entirely mine. So very quick sort of 5 points. First point is, it is a common mistake to view the South China Sea dispute and the roles and policies of the claimants as some kind of, morality play or morality tale. That is precisely how you will not understand Malaysia. This is precisely how you will simplify the situation into a struggle between, good and bad, and somehow, providing a moral lesson at the end of the day. That is not going to be very helpful. There is a place for that, perhaps, but not if you want to understand the policies of the claimant states. And for Malaysia, well, in the real world, our political leaders have to deal with the fact that China is very willing to be either very generous or very punitive with regards to economic relations. In the real world, there are significant economic considerations, which Dr. Lai Yuming will address. In the real world, right now, we have to think about whether Malaysia is going to get vaccines for the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, that might have to come from China. So you need strong and stable relations with China. In the real world, you have to deal with you know, the fact that you don't want to get entrapped by the great power politics. So and that will be addressed by my fellow panelists as well, Dr. B. Hamzah. So which brings me to the second point. In the real world, this is not just a dispute between Malaysia and China. This tends to be the simplification that really there's a gross oversimplification. Malaysia views this as a dispute. Okay, sure, Malaysia and China, that's the most serious, especially since 2013. This is a relatively new thing for us compared to Vietnam and the Philippines. China did not come down south until much later to our bit. But this is also a dispute with Vietnam. Vietnam occupies several territories that Malaysia also claims. Vietnamese fishing fleets are a serious issue for Malaysia. It is a major irritant in the relationship. Maybe about a month or two ago, a Vietnamese fisherman was shot by the Malaysia Coast Guard during an altercation. And it's not always clear that the interests of Malaysia and Vietnam are entirely aligned. There is this perception that Vietnam has an additional sort of avenue to manage its relations with China through the Vietnamese Communist Party that Malaysia does not have. So Vietnam is seen as having this advantage that we do not have, that we somehow are somewhat a little suspicious that Vietnam can somehow do a deal with China. This is also a dispute between Malaysia and the Philippines, and it is the Philippine claim over Sabah is a major irritant in the relationship. This is not an abstract thing. It is a claim over a territory in which people live. It's not some uninhabited island or sparsely inhabited island in the middle of nowhere. So which is why when people come over and visit us at IDSS and say, "Oh, why don't you form a common coalition against China?" Well, I say, well, it's not that simple, right? So let me go to my third point, which is that there is a deeply entrenched consensus within the Malaysian government on how to address the South China Sea dispute. Of course, there are varying perspectives. People do not always agree with each other and all that. But among people who actually make policies, I think there is a set of sort of like common, sort of like core principles that they agree on. As an outsider, I don't have full sight of all the discussions, obviously. As an outsider, my impressions of the consensus are, number one, always consider the broader aspect of the relationship with the claimants, including whether it's China, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's the Philippines. Number two is a preference for quiet diplomacy. And this preference for quiet diplomacy is often validated. For example, the West Capella standoff or incident, whatever you want to call it, earlier this year, on the Malaysian side, we look at how that ended, and that ended without ships ramming into each other and so on and so forth. Yes, it was not a pleasant thing, but at least people not thrown off boats and all that. We compare that with how the Vanguard Bank incident took place in 2019 between Vietnam and China, and we think, well, some similar aspects in the two incidents, but somehow we settled this perhaps a little more cordially with China. And I'm not speaking out of thin. I think I'm not seeing anything that is secret. There was a sort of like an arrangement for that to be de-escalated between the Malaysian and the Chinese side. So this preference for quiet diplomacy is often validated among the officials in Malaysia. Number three, the third of this consensus is that do not give China an excuse to escalate. basically the underlying assumption is that if you give them an excuse to escalate, they will escalate, they will take it. Not only will they take it, they will have escalation dominance. And when they have escalation dominance, they will stay where they are. If they take an island, if they take a structure, if they secure anything, they will not go away. Okay. So the consequences of a misstep in relation to China are severe and irreversible. Right? The fourth aspect of this consensus, again, my personal impression is that hydrocarbons are the main game. Now, of course, officials will tell you that everything is important, but my impression is that the hydrocarbon aspect is several more degrees more important than the other economic aspects. So the continental shelf is a lot more serious for us compared to the water column. I mean, I'm not saying it's not important, but I think that there's a distinction, that there's a preference or emphasis on the hydrocarbons on the continental shelf. And the final bit of the consensus that I can figure out is that be serious about your lawfare. Be serious about using legal measures, multilateral measures to pursue Malaysia's objectives. So you can see this from the Malaysian submission to the continental limits of the continental shelf, the response to China and the Philippines. This consensus is actually shaped mostly or sustained mostly, this is my fourth point, by a rather small cohort of officials. They are mostly civilians, but they're also law enforcement and military. Of course, they have to get their policies passed through the political leadership, but they play a very crucial, important role in framing the issues, framing the options, and also providing institutional memory. And there is a strong emphasis on consistency. Yeah, sorry, I'll take one more minute. The consistency is often seen as some sort of virtue almost. So yeah, when I talk to them, the word consistency comes out a lot. We are consistent compared to country X, for example. The tier one players, I would say, in this small cohort of officials are mostly people in the Maritime Department of Foreign Ministry, and the Maritime Security and Sovereignty Division of the National Security Council. Of course, when it comes to naval operations and so forth, MINDEF and the MEFHQ, their roles get catapulted to the top. On domestic, final point on domestic pressures, media and the local fishermen and MPs, I will address during Q&A. I'm sorry, I went over time.
That's fine.
Especially the pressures are not as severe as one would I think experience in the Philippines and Vietnam. Sorry to go over time. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much for keeping almost to the time. I won't attempt at all to summarize your very, very lucid 5 points. Maybe there were some sub points to the 5 points, but we can always get to them later. So let's turn to the next speaker now, and he would be Dr. Lai Yu Meng. I have a friend who's Lai Yuwa, so I got mixed up. Dr. Lai Yu Meng. Now, Dr. Lai, I think you will speak to us more about the sort of economic kind of aspects, as well as whatever you think is relevant for this discussion.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. Johan. A very good morning to you and to all the distinguished speakers and participants of today's RSIS seminar. Firstly, please allow me to express my sincere thanks to RSIS for this invitation to speak at this esteemed webinar. I'm indeed privileged to be in the presence of a congregation of distinguished scholars whose reputation precedes them, namely Prof. Johan yourself, Prof. Dato B.A. Hamzah, Dr. Collin, and Mr. Shahriman Lockman, whom I've known for many years. Now, secondly, like Shahriman, I would also like to state that what I'm about to share today are my personal opinion and do not represent the official views of my university and also research funding bodies which I'm affiliated with. Now that I've got this disclaimer out of the way, ladies and gentlemen, please let me start by stating what is obvious and undeniable, that South China Sea is integral and vital to Malaysia's economic prosperity and well-being. Now, we are all aware that South China Sea's biodiverse maritime surroundings are abundantly rich, not only in terms of hydrocarbon deposits, but also fish stock and other marine resources, as mentioned by Shahriman just now, the importance of hydrocarbon. This makes the sea a major source of economic, food, and energy security for littoral states like Malaysia, which straddles on this body of water. Now, talking about Malaysia's economic interest in the South China Sea, one would immediately zoom into what are at stake for Malaysia. And the common attention would be to highlight, as Shahriman highlighted, the significance of hydrocarbon, or in layman's term, oil and gas deposit, and their share of revenue to the Malaysian economy. Indeed, oil and gas is a key sector that plays a vital role in Malaysia's economy, contributing approximately 20% of its national GDP annually. Forecasts even suggested the possibility of 5% growth annually despite current market uncertainties. Now, in terms of export, crude petroleum comprises an average of between 2.5 to 3.5% of Malaysia's total annual export, while petroleum-related products contribute between 6 to 8%. In this context, the terrestrial features, the continental shelves, and the maritime zones claimed by Malaysia in the South China Sea are important for specifically the reason of resource access. Now, if one could recall, the so-called race for resource access in the South China Sea arguably started following a 1969 United Nations report, which predicted the prospects of huge oil and gas reserves being discovered in both the East and the South China Sea. Since then, there have been periodical reports on the South China Sea possessing estimates of between 11 to 22 billion barrels of oil and between 190 to 290 trillion feet of natural gas. All these estimates makes the South China Sea the so-called second Middle East. Now, for Malaysia, being Southeast Asia's second largest oil and natural gas producer and the world's third largest liquefied natural gas or LNG exporter, it has to be said that Malaysia derives a substantial portion of its hydrocarbon resources from the South China Sea. And of course, with ONG contributing significantly to the country's annual revenue, it is reasonable to conclude that Malaysia's prosperity is by and large dependent on this semi-enclosed sea. Secondly, besides hydrocarbon, the fish stock in the rich marine ecosystem of South China Sea are also a major food source. Now, for fishermen from both sides of the Malaysian land masses, including those from Sabah and Sarawak, the South China Sea has been their traditional fishing ground and a key source of protein and economic livelihood. For instance, the quote-unquote disputed Malaysian offshore features such as Beting Patindi Ali, Beting Raja Jarum, Beting Surupai, which are all less than 100 kilometers away from Sarawakian shores. Not to mention layang-layang and mantanani off the Kudat and Kota Belud coast of Sabah. All these have been previously frequented by local fishermen dependent on this marine ecosystem for food and livelihood. Thirdly, South China Sea's geo-economic potential also comes in the form of tourism. The terrestrial feature with natural geosites and idyllic surroundings do have great potential to be developed as tourist attractions to generate revenue, especially for states that appropriate them. For instance, Layang-Layang is as much an exclusive scuba diving resort as a Royal Malaysian Navy outpost called Station 5. Now, together with 300 plus other offshore features off the Sabah coast, they have contributed immensely to enhancing the attractiveness of Sabah, for instance, as a preferred regional tourist destination. Now, last but not least, another fundamental economic interest for Malaysia is ensuring that South China Sea remains primarily a sea of cooperation rather than a sea of conflict. And this is, of course, in the broader context of regional peace and stability. Now, as a key commercial waterway connecting continents and catering for more than 1/3 of global shipping and world trade annually, The South China Sea is a critical economic lifeline, fueling Malaysia's vitality as a maritime trading nation with continental roots. This is especially so since seaborne trade constitute a significant portion of Malaysia's annual trade volume. I think, of course, South China Sea and Malacca Straits both serve as the primary sea line of communication, or SLOC. Now, with China and ASEAN states also being Malaysia's important trading partner, ensuring the South China Sea remains peaceful and calm is critical to Malaysia's economic sustainability. Now, having said all that, the South China Sea is actually just one of the many issues and interests in Malaysia's overall bilateral relations with other South China Sea claimant states, specifically China. Now, when it comes to Malaysia-China ties, I would say that Putrajaya's consideration on the overall economic salience of this bilateral relationship appear to supersede or take priority over other factors or other dynamics. Thus, the related policy approaches, like you have always read, those who are familiar with, such as hedging, mouse deer policy, quiet diplomacy, smart accommodation, etc., coined by various scholars in seeking to explain Malaysia's behavior and preferences of action when dealing with China over the South China Sea. Now, firstly, in terms of bilateral trade relations, China has been Malaysia's largest trading partner for 11 consecutive years since 2009. Meanwhile, Malaysia has been China's 8th largest and 3rd in Asia, if we were to look at 2017 statistics, for instance. I can share a little bit more stats here. For example, bilateral trade reached an all-time high in 2019, accounting for 17.2% of Malaysia's total trade that year. Exports to China constitute 14.2% of the total exports, while China has remained Malaysia's largest import source, accounting for more than 20% share of total imports in 2019. I think my time is almost up. What I want to say here is that it is undeniable that Malaysia is dependent on China, economically speaking, to a certain extent. And that's why, in a nutshell, I would say that both the South China Sea and bilateral ties with China are highly significant to Malaysia's overall economic well-being. And therefore, as mentioned by Shahriman, the need to adopt the various policy approaches like quiet diplomacy, or in IR terms, hedging or light hedging, whatever we want to call it, to try delicately balance between advancing Malaysia's territorial and economic interests in the South China Sea on the one hand, while maintaining favorable ties with China as well as other South China Sea players on the other. With this, I pass it back to you, Prof. Johan. I would also take the opportunity to share more in the second round of our discussion.
So thank you so much, Dr. Lai. You've really enlightened us about the economic situation and the importance of the South China Sea, the ONG resources, as well as the other resources, including fish stock and all those kinds of questions. And finally, you have also pointed to that very, might call it a special relationship that's emerging with China and Malaysia's hedge diplomacy and all that, which are seen as a necessary part of the overall strategy. I'm brimming with questions for you, but I'll restrain myself at the moment, and I'll go on to our third speaker, and who is a good friend and Professor Hamzah, B.A. Hamzah. Are you there, Prof. Hamzah?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here.
Yes, yeah, over to you. Now, I'm sure you have a lot to add to all the current discussion. Yeah, over to you, Hamzah.
Thank you, Johan, and thank you, RSIS, for giving me the honor to share my thoughts on the geopolitical issues in the South China Sea. Now, I have been asked to discuss the geopolitical dynamics in the South China Sea and address some aspects of Malaysia-China's relations in the light of recent events. My two colleagues just before me did a brilliant job in trying to delineate the issues for you all. But before I dive into that, I think it would be useful to put the conversation in a geopolitical perspective, as well as give it some historical context. Firstly, the issues in the South China Sea are so interrelated and so interconnected. One cannot understand the geopolitical dynamics in the South China Sea actually without making references to the larger geopolitical events worldwide. In other words, the geopolitical dynamic in the South China Sea does not exist in isolation. Hence, political developments, events in Washington, D.C., Beijing, Tokyo, and in other ASEAN capitals will continue to shape the geopolitical outlook in the South China Sea. And these will have an impact on how Malaysia reacts on, towards what happened in the South China Sea. The second caveat is this: all things being equal, the South China Sea is only a sideshow in terms of big power politics. There are other things beside the conflict in the South China Sea that China and the United States, for example, are engaged in. While they may not be able to see many things eye to eye on many things under the current presidency of Donald Trump, previously under Bush and Obama, Washington and Beijing have worked closely on many issues like mitigating the global climate change, fighting global terrorism, and also curbing the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So the possibility of them patching up their quarrels worldwide and will have an impact on the situation in South China Sea. And the fact that they can patch up their quarrels should not be ignored. However, the current geopolitical tension in South China Sea are associated, as has been discussed earlier, primarily by the intense US-Sino rivalry over one issue, which to me seems to be who should lead the world. That is the major issue between US and China today. President Trump's advocacy of making United States of America great again is at odds with President Xi's grand design of realizing the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation. You will recall at the ceremony commemorating the 70th anniversary of China as a communist state, President Xi warned that there is no force that can shake the foundation of this great nation. This message was delivered with the US in mind. Of course, the coronavirus or coronavirus pandemic has temporarily, in my view, upset their respective dreams. Incidentally, COVID-19 has destroyed more lives than the 2 atomic bombs that we all know that America dropped over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1946. The third issue I want to raise is this: the global geopolitical landscape is being reshaped by new challenges, and they will affect how countries in the region see the situation in the South China Sea. Among them are the fury of the coronavirus and the breakdown of the post-1945 international order, following the strategic decline of the United States. By most estimates, the US no longer enjoys global primacy. But because Washington finds it difficult to acknowledge that its heyday is over, it acts rashly most of the times, in my view. Now, leading neoconservatives in the United States, like Steve Bannon and others, have predicted that the US and China will fight a war in the South China Sea. God forbids that it happens, actually. Professor Graham Allison's theory of Thucydides' trap, speculating a violent transition, has emboldened, in my view, China not to let its guards down. Now, I have strong hunch that China, a nation with more than 5,000 years of civilization, will not be trapped as the Soviet were under the Cold War era. So once we understand this fear of China, we can now understand why the United States, the existing power, is so infuriated with China's idea to rewrite the rules of engagement. Now, one final caveat, that the power distribution in the world is undergoing structural changes. The world has become more disarray, more chaotic, more uncertain politically, more multipolar, and more multi-aligned than a decade ago. The power centers in the new multipolar world include some of the traditional powers like Russia, France, UK, Germany, and Japan. With the exception of Germany and Japan, all have got nuclear weapons that we all fear. Interestingly, all were warring powers. They had fought each other for the leadership of the international system. And more importantly, in the context of our conversation, they all colluded to partition China in the 19th century. Now, try to look at it from the perspective of Beijing. So these were the members of the 8-nation military alliance that was set up in 1900 to control China. Of the gang of 8, only Putin Russia today has become China's friend. Meanwhile, Japan, India, Australia, and South Korea, to a limited extent, are middle powers that have ganged up to limit China's growing political and military influence. Earlier in the week, it was Tuesday or Monday, Mike Pompeo was seen in Tokyo, apparently attending a meeting with the foreign ministers of the Quad group. This is the Bilateral Security Dialogue members. Yeah? The Quad's future, in my view, is a big question mark. And I will explain later on if there is anybody interested on it. That compounding the geopolitical challenges in the region are new, what I call geographical domains beside the traditional land, sea, and air. And developments in the outer space, in the digital space, and in the cyberspace world will have an impact on the geopolitical situation in the South China Sea. And all this, in my view, has a bearing on the geopolitical tension in the South China Sea, to which Malaysia will have to respond to. Let me turn now to the geopolitical tension in the South China Sea. I'd just like to address the consequences of a possible military blow-up in the South China Sea on the region. The first consequence would be that the confrontation will interrupt the global supply chain with adverse impact on our economy and livelihood. The interruption to the global supply chain is further compounded by COVID-19 pandemic that has unleashed, in my view, the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression of 1929. Mind you, the Great Depression has caused so much political upheavals preceding World War II. I'm not suggesting that what will happen in South China Sea will lead to World War III. The second consequence of a military conflict is to further accelerate the arms race in the region. Now, according to SIPRI, Stockholm Institute of Peace Research and Institute, the defense outlay for the region in 2018 was 40% higher than in 2010. And this trend is quite troubling because all the countries which have spent money on defense believe that China is the threat. And China is not likely to go away. Therefore, you can expect to see a higher military expenditure in the future in the region. Now, the third consequence is the impact of the rivalry of us on ASEAN as an organization. And Malaysia, of course, is a member of ASEAN. Yeah? They will impact Malaysia on this. If a military conflict were to occur, and I said, God forbid, some member ASEAN states may be placed under extreme pressure to take sides. And I fear that the abandonment of neutrality in regional politics may unwittingly destroy ASEAN unity. A breakup of ASEAN will be a tragic consequence. Some say that China has a design to split ASEAN unity. Finally, let me share with you my thought on China-Malaysia relations in the South China Sea, probably as addition to what additional notes to what Lockman had just mentioned. There are a couple of points to ponder. First, Malaysia has been accused of being very soft on China. The description, in my view, is very accurate, very apt. I don't think I can deny that. Second, this soft policy of active engagement with a strong neighbor will continue unchanged in the future. Despite what you've been reading in the newspapers. And I think it is useful to bear in mind that Malaysia maintains a policy of active engagement with China and other countries in the region. So Malaysia will continue to be upset with Beijing's provocations in its waters, especially over Laconia shoals and James shoal. But it will not rush to bandwagon with those who wish to contain and sanction China for very obvious reasons. I will repeat that one. Malaysia will not rush, in my view, to bandwagon with those who wish to contain and sanction China for various reasons. I'm speaking here in my own personal capacity. So Malaysia and China, as you all know, have been friends for many generations. True, there were some difficult times, but we overcame them. As the first ASEAN country, I'm talking about the original 5 ASEAN member states, to develop diplomatic relationship with China in 1974, it values its friendship with the Middle Kingdom. Although Malaysia welcomes Mike Pompeo's support of Malaysia's claim in the South China Sea vis-a-vis China, it only relates to one issue, which is security in the South China Sea. Malaysia's relations with China has never been premised, in my view, on any single issue. And Putrajaya believes that China's provocation and intimidation in the South China Sea can be restrained by adroit diplomacy, or as somebody suggested, quiet diplomacy. And I believe that the foreign policy of Malaysia towards China is driven more by its domestic imperatives than by any other factor. Now, finally, despite the provocation and intimidation in the South China Sea, Malaysia does not consider China as a threat to its security. The little bumps in our diplomatic relationship should not be allowed to spoil the bigger strategic concern that both of us have. So besides, this is my personal view again, as a small nation, it is not advisable for Malaysia to mess up with a Goliath. However, we should defend whatever our interests are at sea. So my time is up. I'll be happy to take questions from wherever you are located later on. Thank you.
Thank you, BA. Thank you very much. You raised some very, very crucial and certainly important questions, the geopolitical ones and so on. I won't attempt to summarize it all. Certainly there will be, I think, a lot of things to discuss in our open session. So without further ado, let me invite our discussant first to point the way. Dr. Collin Koh.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, allow me to thank my colleagues from the Malaysia program, Ariel, Nawal, for inviting me to come and join this session. It's a great honor to listen to what I will really call an all-star team from Malaysia to present essentially Malaysia's policies on the South China Sea. And it's great to see some of my friends here, Shahriman, for example. It's good to have you again. Not too long ago, we just joined one podcast talking about the same issue. So it's good to rehash the same issues again. As a discussant, I wouldn't want to sort of, touch on the same old issues that have been talked about earlier. But first of all is to share with you what we discussed as we initially conceptualized this particular webinar. And we have one very nagging question in our mind is to, of course, try to make sense of Malaysia's South China Sea policy across 3 different administrations. So we are talking about the Barisan National Administration from the beginning. We're talking about later on the Pakatan government, and then right now the Perikatan government, and to ask ourselves what has changed. Is there anything that we should take note and to take home in terms of key lessons, key trends to highlight? And the panel has already touched on these key issues of concern. of course, Shahriman has talked about the broader overview of the South China Sea policy of Malaysia, and largely also touching upon how the policies were being derived, what are the key influences in it. And Dr. Lai Yu-Ming talks about the economic stakes that are in question on the South China Sea, and of course, largely also talking about the broader stakes at hand between Malaysia and China in this broader relationship that has a very strong economic dimension. I have some questions to ask for that later. And the Professor Hamzah talks about geopolitics, and of course, aptly highlighted that the South China Sea issues do not exist in isolation of its own. It is influenced by a whole confluence of factors that makes the whole issue here extremely complicated. It's not just about the fact that the South China Sea dispute is a multilateral dispute itself, but you're talking about the South China Sea being an international medium where you have to take into account the actions, the interests of the other key stakeholders outside the region as well. So this actually makes policy making complicated, and I think by extension making outsiders like ourselves looking outside Malaysia to try to make sense of what Malaysia is thinking about and try to enact policies regarding the South China Sea extremely difficult. So these are the key lessons that I thought could be distilled from the discussion earlier. And I myself have some questions that I would like to ask. I understand there are some sensitivities, concern when it comes to some of the questions I asked. So I beg the pardon from my fellow panelists if I ask those questions. You are free to address them to any manner you want or not at all. So I just want to ask a few questions which I thought arises throughout the discussion, and some of those that came to my mind for a long time when I embarked on research on the South China Sea. So now I think this is addressed to all panelists, so I wouldn't want to attribute to any one of you, but to probably ask one question I thought would be interesting is to what extent there is coordination between the federal government and the state level responses to China in the South China Sea. And I say this with respect to, in particular, East Malaysia. And we are also referring largely to, say, Sarawak, for example, where, of course, the South Luconia falls within the EEZ of Sarawak. And at the same time, we are also referring to a very recent development that is interesting, which is the issue between the Sarawak state government and Petronas, and who exactly has the authority over oil and gas resources in the EEZ of Sarawak, and who is supposed to be influencing the policy for future energy development and potentially joint development if it ever comes into fruition with China or other claimants in the South China Sea. So that is the one question that I have regarding federal and state level coordination. And the second question, which I thought is a little bit much more sensitive, will be to what extent personalities of key policy elites in Malaysia play a role in sort of shaping the discourse. Shahriman had mentioned earlier that there are some of those key players, tier one players, for example, who come from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and there is a consensus. And of course, Shahriman mentioned also about the sort of some key differences between those policymakers, but there is a consensus. But I just want to sort of probe further for all panelists, to what extent does personality plays a role in this regard? And I say these in reflection of the very recent sort of reporting of the previous government, in particular Tun Mahathir, and his remarks on the South China Sea, and to what extent we should take certain personalities more seriously, or do they reflect the broader policy, or do they just purely reflect, the key policy elite's personal view? So this is something that I thought, it would be important to deconflict for our better understanding. And the third question I have is with regard to economic resilience. And of course, I thought Dr. Lai might be in a better position to answer, because I'm not an economist by training, but I would agree that the broader economic relationship with China is of utmost importance. But I would imagine linking to what Shahriman has mentioned earlier with regard to giving China no excuse to escalate. I mean, we can think about all sorts of ways China could escalate situation in the South China Sea, but one thing you can think about would be economic coercion as a potential tool in China's toolkit in trying to force other countries in the South China Sea to bend to its will. And I would imagine Malaysian policy elites will be very, very well cognizant of this particular challenge. And so to what extent has building economic resilience played a role? And more specifically, to what extent has economic diversification played a role in Malaysia's broader policy vis-a-vis China and even other claimants in the South China Sea? So these are some of the questions I have in trying to sort of hopefully deepen the discussion. So I don't want to take up too much time, and I will just leave it to moderator, Professor Johan, to take the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, for posing those questions for us. I do have several questions of my own, but I will just maybe just add one sort of issue that perhaps Shahriman could answer, and that would be in relation to the current administration and previous administration's view of the so-called incursions that have occurred. I think the Auditor General pointed out to something like a massive number of incursions by China, I think something in the region of 89, over the period of 2016 to 2019. How has Malaysia viewed this sort of thing? And the kind of question I would pose to Dr. Lai would be, is there a particular perspective that comes, which is actually in keeping with your question as well about federal-state relations, but is there a kind of, is the South China Sea particularly important for Sabah? And why is this so? And also tell us a bit about the project that your university has on small islands research, and how is this related to that? So for the moment, I think we have enough things to talk about before we go into the Q&A session. For the general question of the federal-state relations, who would like to start on that one, which is posed by Collin? Who would like to sort of begin with that one? I think, would you like to start, Shahriman, on some of the questions? And then after that, Prof. Hamzah.
So, yeah, the relationship between federal and state government, coordination is not always there. Sometimes the state government would do things like declare like a nature reserve or marine reserve park or something like that. For example, Lukunia Shoals, and not tell the federal government about it, or tell the federal government very, very late, or rather, just days before publishing the Gazette. So there is that lack of coordination from time to time. The Sarawak state government is somewhat under a bit more pressure from their fishing communities. The previous Chief Minister of Sarawak, Adnan Satem, he was very, very critical of the MMA, the Malaysia Coast Guards. He basically, he would say some very unkind things about them. So yeah, they are responding to some of the pressures from the fishing communities there. But our fishing industry is nowhere as big as Vietnam, for example.
Okay.
So it's not like a big lobby. So the pressure does not filter through to Kuala Lumpur, Putrajaya. It sort of like stops at Kuching for some reason. Should I go to the role of personalities, or should I save that for later? Okay. So personalities, yeah, they do have some impact. For example, in the Barisan National Government before 2018, we had Shahriman Kasim as the minister in charge of the Coast Guard, for example, and he was quite a bit of a hawk, actually, to be honest. So the Coast Guard was actually quite not aggressive, but quite assertive in its enforcement, including with regard to Chinese fishing boats. So yeah, there is that impact, but on the grand strategic level, there is that consensus. So it affects the impact of personalities are in the margins, Anifah Aman as foreign minister, he coming from Sabah, he felt a bit of an ownership on over the issue, so he had an impact on that as well. But overall, yeah, the impact is it's more of it's on the sidelines. Incursions, Auditor General's report.
Yeah.
Okay, that's another example of how sometimes things are not entirely coordinated. That Auditor General decided to publish this report, and somehow some people thought, oh, this was in response to Pompeo's remarks and all that. Major conspiracy theory is going on. No, nothing like that. It was an administrative measure.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, the response by this government was to say, look, we are handling it. I mean, that's all they can say, really. I mean, they do not want to say too much about the situation and make it into a big public debate issue, so on and so forth. It is quite, I mean, that it would have been what the Pakatan Harapan would have done, I think, would have been what Pakistan National Government before that would have done. Yeah.
So if I can interrupt here, generally it's been a consistent, your argument of a consensus, that kind of consensus exists, would you say, among the sort of the major establishments that are, involved, including, say, MINDEF and all that, on this overall
I think there is a general consensus. Obviously, I mean, there are some people in uniform probably not terribly happy with how things are going, but when they're in the meeting room, I mean, there is that they ham together towards the middle. It's also the nature of our situation. I mean, the options are not there. We are not in control of all the elements. This is Malaysia is deeply vulnerable to what is happening in the South China Sea. We are separated into two bits, right? South China Sea divides the country or links the country or whatever you want to call it, right? So that vulnerability also limits Malaysia's options.
Okay.
That's South China Sea, right? So yeah, I'm sorry I didn't answer the whole thing.
No, that's fine. Prof. Hamzah, you raise your hand, please.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to weigh in on the issue of this federal-state relationship and try to give an explanation to the question that was raised by Dr. Collin with regard to, for example, the oil extraction. Now, it's quite clear, Malaysia is a federal state, meaning that there are certain things which come under the jurisdiction of the federal state and certain jurisdiction come under the state.
Okay.
We call it federalist and stateless. When it comes to foreign policy, it is a responsibility of the federal government to decide how to deal with another foreign power. That is not a state issue. Similarly, when it comes to defense, it is also the federal government's function. Now, with regard to petroleum, I think that was what Collin was trying to get answers from. The exploration and exploitation of petroleum resources in Malaysia is governed by a law called the 1976 Petroleum Act. Okay. And there was, of course, before Malaysia was formed, agreement between the state and the federal company on the division of the sharing. So we don't want to go into detail. So with regard, and then, okay, a question was raised, and it tries to imply, trying to get, or not imply, so much to get seek answers to what is Sabah and Sarawak is doing. Okay, now, in Malaysia, the Territorial Sea of Malaysia, there's an act called the Territorial Sea Act of 2012. It gave the right of Malaysia to establish a territorial sea for 12 months, which is standard worldwide. But under another act, a domestic act, it allows the states only to acquire up to 3 nautical miles. There is some inconsistency, but I don't want to go into details of it. So you can understand the problem. So it all depends where the oil is produced. In the case of, there was a case involving the state of Kelantan against the federal government on the issue of, what do you call this? Oil dividends and all those things. There was a royalty that was, it was thrown out purely because it is outside the state jurisdiction. So that I hope that people can understand the relationship between federal and state over certain things is governed by laws, and as far as Malaysia is concerned. All right. So I will just leave it at that for the time being.
Dr. Lai, would you like to chip in on some of the questions?
Yes.
Sorry, yeah, on the question of economics and resources and so on.
Sure, thank you. I totally agree with what Prof. Hamzah mentioned just now, and it is very obvious that when it comes to federal-state relations, there are specific compartmentalization of portfolios and jurisdiction, based on the federal and the state list. So when it comes to petroleum exploration, again, Dato Hamzah has mentioned very clearly, it depends on the so-called territorial sea jurisdiction at the national level vis-a-vis the state level. So in Sabah's case, it is very obvious that most of the oil wells off the Sabah shores are definitely more than three nautical miles from Sabah's what I would call landmass or base point. So therefore, together with that so-called petroleum surrender agreement that we talk about 1976, it is very obvious that exploration and also the exploitation of oil and gas resources off the Sabah coast, especially in the deep sea areas, would definitely be under the national jurisdiction, which is under Petronas. When it comes to federal-state relations, in terms of whether or not they are in sync with each other, I would say in general, yes, they are. Perhaps only whenever there is, this is my personal view, whenever there's a necessity to play to the domestic political, the domestic audience when it comes to certain period of domestic political developments. Therefore, you may find some noises being made by the state government or specific political actors from the state government in order to try to make the issue a little bit more visible, so as to sometimes, for the purpose of political maneuvering, to put the federal government perhaps on a specific position, or probably on a defensive position sometimes. No, but let me talk a little bit more about Sabah's relations with China. I have to say very clearly that, of course, China is very important to Sabah. And I would say because geographically speaking, Sabah is the most proximate of Malaysian territories to China. And therefore, it does carry geopolitical and economic salience to both China and to Malaysia as a federal state, and also to Sabah. Let me talk a little bit about the from the economic perspective. For instance, it is undeniable that there is very high economic complementarity between China and Sabah. Now, insofar as I would say Sabah offers rich natural resources, and also cheap labor, I would say, whereas China has the capital investment and technological wherewithal. Therefore, the prospect is indeed very bright in broadening cooperation between China and Sabah. This is between sub-state and state-level relations, which is now basically considered to be a norm compared to probably 20, 30, 40 years ago, where international relations is purely between state actors. Now, I have to say here that in reality, at this particular moment, at this particular juncture, the level of cooperation between China and Sabah remains relatively low. And of course, there are wide untapped opportunities in the market. And in fact, this was also the remark given by the Consul General of China based in Kota Kinabalu back in late 2019 during a gathering between the Sabah Chinese Chamber of Commerce in discussing about the prospect of alleviating Sabah's relationship with China and with specifically some Chinese city, including Wuhan itself. Now, the most encouraging economic area to date now in Sabah-China economic relations would be tourism and the hospitality industry. I did not have the chance to highlight this just now. Of course, national level wise, Malaysia's tourism industry did actually benefited immensely from the influx of mainland Chinese tourists. This is especially so since 2014. Now, I can share with you a little of the annual statistics here. For instance, China tourist arrival to Malaysia had actually increased twofold here, from 1.6 million to almost 3 million last year. 1.6 million back in 2014 to 3 million in 2019. And of this, Sabah has become arguably the biggest beneficiary. Yeah, Sabah recorded close to 4 million tourist arrivals back in 2018, of which Chinese tourists made up almost 45%, or equivalent to approximately 600,000 of the international arrival that year. Yeah, and of course, the exponential increase here is directly related to the presence of the Chinese consulate in Kota Kinabalu. Also, at the same time, there is what we call as special arrangement, visa arrangement for Chinese tourists, and not to mention more than 120 plus flights from China, from more than 10 cities in China connecting Chinese city with Kota Kinabalu. So you can just imagine how significant and how important is tourism or Chinese tourism to Sabah's economic well-being and Sabah's the Sabah economy itself. Because I have to state here very clearly, Sabah's economy is not as diverse as we would like to see it, and the economy is rather dependent as well on tourism and hospitality as one of the key generator or driver of the Sabah state economic performance or vitality over the last 5 to 6 years or so. Maybe I can also talk a little bit about developments at the sub-state level. Yeah,
all right. Final point.
And China, especially. When you talk about sub-state level relations, you also talk about people-to-people relations, people-to-people interactions, and you have all this concept of sister cities. Yeah, it is interesting that China and Sabah relationship in this dimension is indeed blossoming. For instance, as I mentioned just now, Wuhan and Kota Kinabalu actually have established what we call as friendship and cooperation ties. And in fact, there have been plans to elevate these bilateral ties to quote-unquote friendship and sister city status. That took place back at the end of November, if I'm not mistaken, November 2019, all before the pandemic struck. Yes. So that this is in a nutshell some of the how important China is actually to the state of Sabah. But let me also touch a little bit about Chinese investment in Sabah.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Now, it cannot be denied that Sabah is a beneficiary of the Belt and Road Initiative. Yeah. Many would suggest that Sabah is an important node along the 21st century maritime Silk Road, making it in fact very integral to China's BRI agenda. Now, as BRI continues to develop, cooperation between China and Sabah on many fronts have indeed grown closer, with more Chinese companies developing strong interest in Sabah and also looking for investment opportunities here. For instance, BRI-related companies such as China State Construction Engineering, China Railway Group, the State Power Investment Corporation, and also PetroChina, all of them have already arrived in Sabah.
Okay.
All right. So that's why the arrival of these Chinese companies indeed have not only brought development in terms of infrastructure, but also it has generated and given the local economy a great boost during the last 3 to 4 years or so. So this is in a nutshell as to why for the state government of Sabah, irrespective of what I would call as regime change, I would say that there will not be a significant shift in terms of the overall importance of China to Sabah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lai. You've really explicated the thing, very well, and particularly from a Sabah perspective. I think we now have to really move into the Q&A session. There are questions being posed by our 115 participants here. I also have 1 or 2 questions, but I think I will allow the audience to participate by giving you their questions. So I will just read the questions first, and then any one of you perhaps can sort of jump in and answer, including Collin, if you have something to add to the question. So the first sort of question that is posted by somebody from University of Warwick was what are Malaysia's resources in terms of its capacity? What does Malaysia have sufficient capacity to protect its interests? And how should Malaysia enhance its military capability to address the challenges in the South China Sea? So I just put the questions up first, and then you can see who wants to answer them. And then another one that is posed here is, given the successful start to trilateral patrols in Sulu and Celebes with Indonesia and Philippines, is there any movement or enthusiasm in Malaysia towards multilateral patrols, in parts of South China Sea, either as another trilateral or with 5 power defense countries? I should even throw in the one about ASEAN. Is there a possibility that this happens? I think that kind of question has been posed. Another question is posed as to the increasing assertiveness of China in terms of its claims, its occupation, of the features, and its building of military capacity on these features. And what is then Malaysia's view of this, as well as Malaysia's view of the US FONAPs, freedom of navigation patrols in the South China Sea. That's another kind of question which perhaps Prof. Hamzah can answer. I think, okay, another one would be is about Malaysia's views in other nations' involvement in South China Sea issues beyond US and China. We've talked quite a lot about China and a little bit about, US, but what about Australia, Japan, India? I think Prof. Hamzah, you mentioned the Quad, France, Germany, EU, and so on. So what is Malaysia's perspective on this? And I'll throw in my question, and that what do you think about the kinds of cooperation modalities that Malaysia itself has sort of carried out in terms of JDAs, Joint Development Agreements? We have JDAs in the South China Sea. We have one with Brunei, which was done in 2009, right? Yeah. And that was actually even suspending our respective claims on a particular sector which was overlapping. There's also a JDA, if I'm not mistaken, with Vietnam, and certainly in the Gulf of Thailand, not in the South China Sea, we have JDAs. So what do you think of that as a modality moving forward in terms of cooperation? So over to anybody who would like to start on these questions. Shall we start with you, Prof. Hamzah?
My dear friend, you're putting me on the spot,
Not really. You have all the answers.
No, let me take your question first. Okay. On the modality. If you look at the South China Sea, we talk so much about conflicts, but very little about cooperation. All right. And I think which is high time that as we address the issues of conflict, we also take note of what has been done at sea in order to promote cooperation between the states. Firstly, the idea of Malaysia-Thailand Joint Development Project. That was the first project and was established in 1979.
Which one is it? Sorry?
1979. It was, the period is for 50 years, yeah. We have been very successful. We have been producing oil and gas from that area. The second one was Malaysia-Vietnam joint exploration.
Correct.
For oil in a defined area.
Mm.
That was done in 1992. The involvement of Petronas and Petro-Vietnam had also been very successful, and that is the period is supposed to last for 30 years. Okay, so going on a while. But if you look at the cooperation in South China Sea, there are other cooperative arrangements that I think we should take note. Because I don't want to give you the impression that the South China Sea is only about conflicts. Yeah? For example, the JMSU, which refers to the Joint Maritime Seismic Survey between the national oil companies of the Philippines, Petron, China's National Oil, CNOOC, and Petro-Vietnam, that lasted for 4 years, from 2004 to 2008. It was not continued after 2008, right? So that was another thing you should take into question. And then more recently, there was the Philippine-China joint proposal to explore for oil and gas in some parts, of course, in the South China Sea, of course, yeah. And the MOU actually was signed in 2018. Okay, but we do not know much of the info. We don't have much information on this just yet, you know, on kind of thing. Then I think even if you look at Vietnam and China, yeah, the relationship has been, the cooperation has been quite solid actually. There was this Vietnam-China fishery cooperation in the Gulf of Tonkin.
This is Vietnam and China.
This is Vietnam and China.
Okay.
Fishery cooperation, yeah, in the Gulf of Tonkin. The MOU expired actually in June this year. So I have not got the information whether they will continue, but my information seems to suggest that I think our friends from Vietnam will be able to explain better that they may not be able to continue with that MOU. Their major concern is not so much Tonkin, but their major concern is actually how to cooperate in the mouth of Tonkin. And that is the biggest problem that China and Vietnam has with regard to the maritime issue there. And also there was a lot of people don't realize there was a boundary, that there was an agreement actually signed, or MOU signed in 2011 between Vietnam and China on to provide guidelines for resolving their maritime disputes. Okay, it's an ongoing kind of thing. So what I'm trying to suggest is this: okay, as we look at the conflict, please also pay more attention to what's happening in the Strait of in other cooperation, and also the boundary disputes between China and China. Of course, has got 20 countries. It borders 20 countries. It has solved many of the problems, but even with Vietnam, it has got it did solve settle rather the land problem, boundary problem. So, okay, and then the question was asked on the trilateral cooperative agreement in the between Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia over Sulu, and whether this model can be extended to the South China Sea.
Right.
Now, speaking for myself, I think in principle it should involve stakeholders in principle. But I think states have got their own sensitivities, which I'm not prepared to comment at this stage. You know. Similarly, I think with regard to FPDA, the Five Power Defense Agreement, yeah, or arrangement, that Five Power Defense Arrangement is between 5 states: Singapore, Malaysia, UK, Australia, and New Zealand.
Correct.
So there must be, I do not know what is coordination within the setup, you know. So I don't think any particular state within the organization be able to make an independent decision on whether you want to do this or not, if it is within the framework of the Five Power Defense Arrangement. Personally, I do not think we should extend that, personally, yeah, to the South China Sea area, because that was not supposed to cover the area. The defense, actually the FIDA was actually for the defense of Malaya and Singapore.
Right.
Yeah, okay. The other thing that other stakeholders whether other stakeholders should get involved in the South China Sea. Personally, I think, I'm not speaking for Malaysia, please. For my own, from my perspective, I think you're going to create more problem in South China Sea if you bring in more people into the area. I think this is not the prime time. I think let US and China solve its own problem, because we too have got our own problems with South China Sea. That means meaning that the claimant states, we have unsettled boundaries between ourselves. Philippines, Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia, Malaysia boundary problem to be settled. And I think if you bring in from outsiders into the region, may complicate the thing. Then the question was asked, specifically you asked me to respond to it, FONOPS. Interesting question, because I've written about it. I'm on FONOPS. FONOPS actually started in 1979, before the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention came into effect. And you know, United States is still not a party to 1982 UNCLOS. Of course, UNCLOS, US argued, does not cover, or rather, doesn't come under UNCLOS. FONOPS doesn't come under. Now, the purpose of FONOPS is, in the point of the United States, is that to challenge any state that make excessive claims at sea. How excessive claims at sea is defined by the United States, So I'm not very keen to support this kind of operation. To me, I have argued elsewhere that it is not based on law. It is very much an operation that only United States, and today we got other countries joining United States to conduct this kind of thing. What happened in South China Sea, to me, is no longer FONOPS, become very routine operation, almost a weekly or monthly operation. So, if it's a FONOPS, if you want to say to China that, look, you have excessive claim to make, I think once or twice in 10 years would be enough, not to do it almost every day, because it become routine operation. That is my personal view on this, my dear friend. Thank you.
Prof,
right, please.
May I just jump in, since it's interesting that one of the questions that was asked was by someone from the University of Warwick, and I'm a Warwick alumni.
Okay.
Incidentally, he asked about whether or not how is Malaysia responding from the so-called defense or military dimension in order to so-called check these sort of challenges, the security challenges in the South China Sea. Now, let me state here very clearly that the legal and diplomatic tools, I would say instrument, remains the primary instruments used by Malaysia as a so-called smaller state when it deals with bigger powers in the South China Sea. This is definitely due to the anarchic world and also the asymmetry of power relations, which is very clear. And not to mention rivalry between the major powers, and also uncertainties that continue to dictate developments in the South China Sea. Now, and I think it is based on such realism that Malaysia has also not only just depend on legal and diplomatic tools or instruments to deal with the South China Sea issue, but instead it has also employed what I would call as a legal defense hedge to try to give Malaysia more options, especially when dealing with bigger powers. Now, when you talk about defense capabilities and defense tools, sometimes defense arrangement as a tool of statecraft not only manifests in terms of hard defense, meaning it is hard power, looking at military balance of power between whatever hardware and software that you use. But it also exists in the form of alliances, and also it can be deployed through concurrent multi-layered military and security partnerships, sometimes even with contending powers. Now, in this case, over the past decades, Malaysia's defense partnership has been that it has continued to step up long-standing military partnerships with the US, with Australia, as we can see through various exercises, including Cobra, Gold, Carrot, and others with the US. It has also, in fact, interestingly, started to develop and strengthen Malaysia's defense cooperation with China. And this is despite China being quote unquote perceived as a potential security challenge to Malaysia's interest in the South China Sea. So this sort of so-called counterintuitive behavior is precisely what hedging is all about in our terms, whereby sometimes we also need to because of the development, it also pushes Malaysia to opposing directions when it comes to engaging the related powers when it comes to military ties. So that is something which is what Malaysia have been doing. Let me talk a little bit about China, Malaysia-China defense arrangement, which perhaps many are not very well aware of as well. In fact, since 2015, Malaysia and China actually held their first live bilateral military exercise. Yes, and they also have forged their first major defense procurement. They have expanded cooperation on non-traditional security issues. And in fact, they have also elevated their defense cooperation to a strategic level. So for me, personally, I think by developing such stronger relations or partnership with China and playing down that so-called China threat, while simultaneously cultivating robust military partnership with the US and Australia, but also at the same time keeping them at the background. Keeping them at the background. I would say that Malaysia has sought to hedge against multiple risks at the same time. And this risk is basically the danger of being entrapped in a potential US-China conflict. Also, the uncertainty of US commitment. I mean, even Japan sometimes raise this question as to whether the US-Japan alliance do actually bring about to the possibility of not only entrapment, but abandonment by the United States. And of course, this is also to hedge against uncertain Chinese intentions, alongside with other associated risks. I would say risks related to domestic authority erosion, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Very good for your perspective on hedging, maybe double hedging as well. I mean,
yes,
I read an article on double hedging. Not sure what it means, but it's interesting. What you're saying, the multi-layered ways in which you can deal with problems. I wanted to ask Shahriman if you could chip in here in terms of our defense capability and so on. We have 2 submarines. How do those stand in terms of the kind of capacity that we may need in the South China Sea?
Yeah, just a side note about the submarines. In spite of all the controversies that have attended to it, those are the Ferraris of Southeast Asian submarines. They are very good submarines.
They're very good.
Underestimate them. We have a good crew, a crew that has been training together for a long while, and they are very, very good. They perform very well against the French who have trained them. So they're about building up military capabilities. Look, I mean, it's very, very difficult now because some very bad decisions were made over the last 2 decades where we have basically delayed major purchases. We have delayed major purchases for too damn long. As a result, we have an inventory of equipment that is very old with very high operational costs. So as a result, if we are going to be very serious about building our military capabilities, it will require a huge amount of investment. Simply because it has been delayed for so long. You delay all those investments, you have old equipment, too bad. You have to replace them instead of having a breathing room of 20, 30 years, you have a breathing room of maybe 5 to 10 years now because some of those equipment is so old. But the trouble is this: every policy starts with tax policy, and when it comes to tax policy, Malaysia does not tax people enough. I'm going to get into trouble with Prof. Jomo if he's still on. We tax people, I think about 12% of GDP. The Europeans tax people up to about 19%. We undertax people. This government does not have money, does not have enough money. So as a result, we are so dependent on things like oil and gas revenue, proceeds from oil and gas revenues, which aren't doing very great right now. It's $40 today a barrel. So as a result, there is no money there. COVID-19 has thrown all long-term purchases, acquisition plans out of the window. What do you want to do, right? So the prospects are not looking great, but thankfully we do have some assistance from the Americans, for example. They have provided very useful equipment, the Scan Eagles. They have our maritime patrol aircraft being upgraded through the Maritime Security Initiative. Thank goodness we have that's a lot of assistance. So I think, yeah, I mean, the ideal is to shift the expenditure from the Army to the Navy and Air Force. It's a lot harder to do because Army has a lot of political sort of power, influence and all that. And, it's just very difficult to shift things here. The thing about FONOPS, can I just add, is seen as a double-edged sword. It's a good thing, it's a bad thing. It's a good thing because it keeps China honest, but at the same time, it also provokes China. It does both things at once. So it's seen with a bit of ambivalence in Malaysia. I think on the expansion of the trilateral patrols to the South China Sea, I agree with Prof. Hamzah. I personally think that this is probably not going to fly. It is probably seen to be too provocative towards China. So maybe exercises are okay, but not joint patrols. Exercises, quote unquote, is okay. Role of others. Okay, sorry. On GDA, a very quick point on GDA. I think the impetus or urgency for a joint development arrangement on hydrocarbons is not there right now. It's only economical to drill when oil prices are about $60 per barrel. Okay. Under $60 doesn't make sense at all because it's not like land where you can just poke your finger into the ground in the desert. You have to go out there and drill for it. So it's right now $40. I don't know. The people are talking about the end of the hydrocarbon age. Maybe it will never be economical again. I don't know. Who knows, right? Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, Collin, do you have anything to add to this? Anything that you might want to?
I just have some questions that I want to follow up, but probably not so much a question, but a comment to what was being discussed earlier. And of course, to try to sort of piggyback on what Shahriman has mentioned about joint development. There was one thing I thought, there is no lack of, initiatives out there. I mean, historically, we have seen South China Sea littorals having engaged in various types of cooperative activities, and one of which dating back to the 1990s initiative by Indonesia, for example. And in fact, back in those very good days, even Taiwan was involved in a number of those marine expeditions in the South China Sea that helped to promote sort of scientific understanding of the South China Sea. These days, we don't see that. And that leads me to, an observation that, there are a lot of talk about joint development, but the issue here is, are we already past the stage of the opportunity? Because, back then, perhaps we wouldn't see the situation of the lack of trust being a problem as serious as what we have now. I mean, the lack of trust right now, would it mean, we could possibly not be able to think very deeply about joint development? I mean, I bring an example of Vietnam, and that was being raised earlier. But what I heard from Vietnam is that, they aren't really very happy with the deal. I mean, they believe, they don't really cut a very good deal with China. They were at the losing end. So, I mean, in some way, there is some sort of a buyer's remorse for Vietnam with regard to the Gulf of Tonkin agreement they had with China. And the question that most people ask would be, why would there be currently some standstill between the Philippines and China over their proposal on, energy development in the area? So is it has to do with, still a lack of trust? So, now the question is, who should kickstart, the process of finding that opportunity? Who is supposed to sort of recover, those good old days where we could really talk about these cooperative activities without having to be beset with those issues. So I think this is one question I keep having in mind, but I believe, we don't have enough time to discuss about this. We could take it offline.
We could definitely. It is past 11. Now is 11:36. I think what I will do is to let everybody have a final statement. If you like, and then I will close the session and thank the audience and all that. Who would like to start with a final statement? Looks like you have made your final statement, right? Collin, would you like to add anything more? He's frozen. So can we start with Prof. Hamzah? Then we start with the most senior, and we end. We go the other way around. There, the most senior.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it has been a very interesting, illuminating discussion, conversation on the situation in South China Sea. I think we have covered many ground. Right. I just want to leave behind a few things. Firstly, I think the issues in South China Sea are not confined only to geopolitical matters between China and the United States. There are other stakeholders whose interests, I think, are quite conveniently ignored when people address the problem in South China Sea. Number two is that challenges between the claimant states and other stakeholders. The problems include unsettled, as I mentioned earlier, maritime boundary problems and access to marine resources. We need to settle this issue between states. And the issue of, for example, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. I mean, Shahriman mentioned that the Malaysian Coast Guard actually shot a Vietnamese. And I think that too is a problem that states in the region must find means and ways to cool down, because otherwise we'll be fighting each other. And I think the countries need to address this. But I just, I don't know how to put it, but I think I got a feeling that a lot of people actually want to humiliate China for what it is. I would like to suggest that those who intend to humiliate China should again revisit history. It was Mark Twain who remarked that history never repeats itself, but it often rhymes. Then the last thing I would say is, in this geopolitical environment that we are facing today of multi-aligned and multipolar world, it is increasingly difficult for any single power to exercise its will. Neither is Washington's idea of collective resilience as a strategy to contain China will work in the long run. To me, China is too big and too populous to contain, and the cost will be too prohibitive as the coalition partners, the 8-nation alliance I mentioned in the 1900s tried to do, and they were proven all wrong because they failed miserably actually to, in their coalition to carve out China into small colonial potentates. As with regard to Malaysia and China relationship, and this is the final statement I want to make, is that yes, there are certain bumps in the relationship, but China is not going to go away, and we're not going to go away. So we have to maintain a civil approach to our relationship. We have to manage the relationship. That's all. And we do hope that on this issue, that China will be much more forthcoming. Itu sajalah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those wise words, Hamzah. Can I move on to Dr. Lai?
Thank you, Prof. As a conclusion, I would say that since we are talking about Malaysia's interest and policy in the South China Sea, I would point and highlight again that Malaysia's hedging approach. I would agree with a good friend of mine, Dr. Quick. I'm sure that everybody knows Dr. Quick, that Malaysia is actually practicing light hedging, I would say. And of course, light hedging is, the need for light hedging is basically due to shifting structural and geopolitical realities as we have discussed. And also, we also need to highlight the salience of domestic political economic factors as well. Now, of course, structurally, Malaysia's hedging approach is necessitated by its small state position, the need for survival And of course, there's a need on the part of Malaysia to cope with this so-called external power asymmetry. Yeah, not to mention rivalry and also uncertainty. So long as external power structure remains unclear and uncertain, Malaysia must continue to hedge, I would say. Now, domestically, a like form of hedging in the shape of a non-confrontational posture to ensure cordial and productive partnership with a proximate giant like China is central to the successive ruling elites' so-called domestic legitimation. Yeah, performance legitimation, I would say. Now, so from Barisan Nasional right up to Pakatan Harapan and now to the current Perikatan Nasional Plus government, Malaysia's ruling elite view a stable and productive relationship with China as central, in fact, a central component of their performance legitimation. And of course, this has been so since Mahathir himself. Yeah, Mahathir was the first ASEAN leader back in the early 90s to declare that China is not a threat but an opportunity. Yeah, and of course, this has continued on and became even more important since 2009, with China becoming Malaysia's largest trade partner and a very significant economic partner all in. Not to mention the massive inflow of Chinese capital due to the launch of BRI in 2013. It has actually increased China's economic importance to Malaysian elite, and that is, of course, in part the explanation of why, despite the then Pakatan Harapan or Mahathir 2.0's earlier decision to review some of the big ticket and controversial quote-unquote BRI projects back in 2018, several of these projects were either being restored or placed under renegotiation, while others continue on. So I would say that maximizing commercial benefits is not a purely economic or foreign policy matter, but in fact, it is a matter of crucial political significance for Malaysian government, whose some domestic authorities may depend on ensuring and delivering economic growth alongside with other pathway of domestic legitimation. That's why the recent political developments following the change of government from in May 2018 and then recently in March 2020, I believe all has not altered this very important point. Hence, I would say that there will be continuity with limited tweaks to Malaysia's South China Sea policy.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Lai. Shahriman?
Yeah. Thanks, Prof. Ariel highlighted a question very last minute. I'm just going to take 3 seconds to answer it. Whether the presence of the Americans and the Australians helped Malaysia to handle the West Papua situation depends on who you ask. Some people in the Malaysian government actually believe that their presence actually made things worse, escalated the whole situation, and left us with more ships to deal with in the end, because after escalating the situation, they left, and they came back periodically. So, that it's a matter of perspective, but again, don't assume that, there's this sense that, American exceptionalism and all that will always make things great. It does not. Can I just end with a recommendation, a practical one, a bit out of not something we've discussed, but look, if you, among the participants here, if you are from some embassy or foundation or something with money to throw, and I know you are listening, you know what? You can help by making the conversations, the discussions about South China Sea issues in Malaysia a lot more sophisticated by helping to fund and train journalists. Okay. Journalists in Malaysia do not really cover the South China Sea issue very well. The likes of Reuters, the South China Morning Post and all that, they do a fantastic job on this, right? Because they have capacity, they have people who know this stuff. But more often than not, local newsrooms are very, their things are very tight. Newsrooms are shrinking. There's an emphasis on reporting stuff on that produces clicks. So, if between dirty water in Kelantan and South China Sea issue, which is abstract out there in the middle of nowhere, what gets the clicks? Dirty water in Kelantan, right? So I mean, it takes, you will need to train local journalists to be able to ask the right questions, to be able to understand the distinctions, simple things like territorial sea, EEZ, so on and so forth. The reason why they stay away from it and do not report it so much, and why the local discourse on South China Sea is so absurdly poor, is because there is very little reporting about it and very, very poor reporting about it. Yeah, so I would urge, yeah, throw money that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahriman. Good advice. Collin, do you have any words to add?
No, thank you. Thank you, Professor Johan, and just leads me to thank all my friends from Malaysia. Being a discussant and a South China Sea watcher, it's really enlightening to listen to your perspective. So thank you so much.
Right. Well, we have come to the end of the webinar. It is, we're now at 11:46, which means, we had a lot of things to say. And I'm sure we still have a lot of things to say. It certainly has been a very important learning experience for me to listen to all your experts. I know a few things about the South China Sea, but I learned quite a lot today. And I'm sure it's true for the audience as well. It remains for me to thank all of you. You gave us a very, very good, important seminar. And I'm sure the listeners who are still there, quite a few of them, 80 odd, also enjoyed the session. Thank you very much for participating in this. And finally, I would like to thank Ariel and her RSIS team for so ably managing this. I think we had no glitches whatsoever. Once or twice we may have not switched on our mics, but overall it has been fantastic. It has been recorded, and if you do need the recording of this webinar, do let the RSIS people know. And it will be available for the public to be shared. So again, thank you very much and a very, very good morning to all of you. Goodbye.